I was in Manhattan on 9/11. That's where I lived and worked, and so remember that day quite vividly. But I also remember every single September 11th thereafter. All 23 of them have been instantly used and exploited to deliver whatever message various political figures or journalists or pundits want to exploit 9/11 in order to convey. And oftentimes, from the very beginning, the message that was chosen was that the reason we were attacked is because we are free, in contrast to Islamic radicals, extremist Islamists, who hate freedom and attacked us simply because they wanted to destroy our freedom. One of the people who said that today, unsurprisingly, because she said it before, is my friend Tulsi Gabbard, who is also serving now as an advisor to the Trump campaign. This is what she put on X earlier today about this solemn day. Quote, as we remember and honor those who were killed in the Islamist attacks on 9/11 and the first responders who put their lives on the line to save others, it's important to remember that the radical Islamist ideology that motivated this tragic attack remains the greatest short and long-term threat to our country and world. It is the same ideology that motivates Islamist terrorists, Hamas, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, and more. We need a president who understands this threat and is committed to defeating it in order to defend our freedom and keep the American people safe. So apparently all these different groups, like you might have thought Hamas's motivation was that they're governing Gaza, a place that has been blockaded by the Israelis for 20 years, that expanding settlements have prevented a sovereign state of any recognizable kind, with the West Bank and Gaza forming a Palestinian state, that the Israelis have bombed Gaza almost every year, not quite as much as they have done over the last 11 months, but oftentimes with great numbers of innocent people dead. You might have thought that's the reason why Hamas fights against Israel. No, that's not the reason. It's because they're radical Islamists. They have the same demented religious ideologies, says Tulsi Gabbard, as Al-Qaeda and all of these other groups, just like Al-Qaeda attacked 9/11, she says, on 9/11, attacked the United States on 9/11, simply because they're radical Islamists too, and this is what radical Islamists do. They attack free people. They hate free people. They hate freedom so much. That's why they attacked us on 9/11, and that's the thing we have to remember every September 11. Now, it's not just prominent American figures, and I could have shown you 20 other examples besides Tulsi Gabbard, of very prominent people saying the same thing. I'm sure you've seen them yourself. It's not just prominent U.S. figures who exploit 9/11 for various causes. It's also foreign leaders. Here was Ukrainian president, apparently for life, or at least indefinitely, since there's no elections, Vladimir Zelensky, who said the following today, quote, on behalf of the Ukrainian people, on behalf of the Ukrainians, I extend our heartfelt condolences to the families and close loved ones of 9/11 victims. We join our key ally, the United States, and the entire American people in today's commemoration of those who perished as a result of this heinous crime. We honor all of those who worked tirelessly in the aftermath of the attack to help others, often sacrificing their lives to do so. We mourn alongside you, our American friends. We Ukrainians are all too familiar with the pain and grief of families who have lost loved ones as a result of terror. We are determined to defend our common values against terror and aggression. Every peace-loving nation and every family deserves to live in safety. We must and will stand together with our allies to ensure this. Terror must never go unpunished. So it's not that just the Ukrainians empathize with us. They have their own 9/11, and they're basically saying, like, remember how upset you were and angry you were and sad you were about what happened? Yeah, we know that too. We have our own 9/11, and that's the reason we need to keep financing our war and paying for our wars and giving us all the arms that we ask for, to the point where you deplete your own stockpiles, because we're basically fighting against the equivalent of Al-Qaeda, which is Russia. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is basically an expert at exploiting 9/11 for his own purposes, also trying to constantly equate the various words that Israel repeatedly has with its neighbors to the way in which the United States was attacked on September 11th, by saying our common enemy are these hordes of Islamists. And in fact, Prime Minister Netanyahu now says that what happened on 9/11 was nothing compared to what happened on October 7th. Yes, 9/11 was bad, but nothing like what happened to October 7th. Here's what he told the U.S. Congress, or at least the part of it that attended, when he spoke to it in July of this year.
Ladies and gentlemen, like December 7th, 1941, and September 11th, 2001, October 7th is a day that will forever live in infamy. It began as a perfect day, not a cloud in the sky. And suddenly, at 6:29 a.m., 3,000 Hamas terrorists stormed into Israel. They butchered 1,200 people from 41 countries, including 39 Americans. Proportionately, compared to our population size, that's like 20 9/11s in one day.
Okay, so we had one 9/11, but Israel had 20 9/11s in the same day. How many 9/11s, by the way, has Gaza had? If you count the number of people who have been killed there, civilians who have been killed there versus their overall population, it's a lot more than 20 9/11s. But here he is telling the U.S. Congress, you had a 9/11, we had 20 times worse than that happen on October 7th. Nobody came to the United States Congress to say.
And these monsters, they raped women, they beheaded men, they burnt babies alive.
Now, we've been over many times that that is a blatant lie. There was a grand total of one baby who was killed on 9/11, who was killed in crossfire between the IDF and the Hamas attackers. There were no babies who were burned alive. There were no babies cut out of wombs. There were no babies beheaded. Joe Biden in November of 2023 actually said that he went to Israel and he saw the pictures of the countless beheaded babies at Hamas's hands on October 7th. Either someone showed him fake pictures or he was hallucinating or lying. Because again, there was a grand total of one baby killed on October 7th. That's just a fact. You don't have to adjust how you think about October 7th if you don't want, but those facts actually matter. None of these things that he's saying here are truthful. But I know it's Israel, so who cares?
They killed parents in front of their children and children in front of their parents. They dragged 255 people, both living and dead, into the dark dungeons of Gaza. Israel has already brought home 135 of these hostages, including 7 who were freed in daring rescue operations.
In any event, they're all standing as they always do whenever he finishes a sentence. It's their moral obligation as representatives of the American people to stand up and cheer when Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, speaks. We all know that. And the whole speech was based on this premise that what happened to Israel was infinitely worse than what happened to the United States on 9/11. He even compared it to Pearl Harbor, the attack on Pearl Harbor that provoked the U.S. participation in World War II. Now, that's the narrative that has always been pushed and affirmed, and it never gets more exploited more than on these anniversary dates of September 11th. And you can understand why. It's a very advantageous narrative to tell people that, oh, look, it's not just you Americans who have been targeted with 9/11. We, the Ukrainians, we, the Israelis, we have our own 9/11s, and we're all in this together. So keep paying for our wars and arming us and devoting everything possible to ensure that our wars can continue because we're fighting your enemies as well. So it's a very useful narrative, not only domestically, but also internationally. And you see that's why people like Netanyahu and Zelensky pay for it. Now, very interestingly, I had the occasion last year, or maybe earlier this year, I don't recall, but I visited it was earlier this year, I visited the official 9/11 museum or memorial. And to be honest, I was kind of dreading going. I wanted to see what was in there, but I was dreading going because I assumed it was going to be just an endless stream of deceitful and manipulative propaganda. And it's actually not that. There's a little bit of that, but far less than at least I expected. It's really a kind of just straightforward memorial that sort of just describes the day in very factual and neutral ways, has a little bit of commentary even that usually doesn't allow its head to appear, including people questioning why 9/11 actually happened. And I was pleasantly surprised by how just matter of fact that museum is, because obviously enormous numbers of people visit New York City and go there, and it's an opportunity that for whatever reason they did not take to manipulate people's emotions into this propaganda. And the 9/11 Memorial website has a very interesting document called the 9/11 Primer, which definitely provides a version of history that is obviously intended to make the United States look as good as possible, but it also doesn't quite embrace the narrative the primary narrative that we're told about why 9/11 happened. Here's what the site says, quote, 9/11 Primer. The 9/11 Primer provides educators and online learners with foundational information about the World Trade Center and the Twin Towers, the 9/11 attacks and their aftermath, and the rebuilding of the World Trade Center site. And then it goes on to say, antecedents of 9/11. Who is responsible for the 9/11 attack and why did they attack the United States? That's obviously a question you would want answered. Not just at the time, but historically, you would want to understand, like, well, why did that happen? What was the motive of it? And here's what they say, quote, the terrorist organization Al-Qaeda was responsible for the 9/11 attacks. Their aim has been to overthrow governments in the Middle East and elsewhere in the Muslim world, which does not, I think that should be, which do not, but whatever, which does not, I'm criticizing not anyone on my staff, but the grammar of the 9/11 site, but who cares? Which does not strictly enforce a narrow fundamentalist version of Islam. U.S. support for these governments was viewed by Al-Qaeda as a major obstacle to this goal. And they hope these attacks would weaken American support for these governments. Al-Qaeda represents only a tiny fraction of the world's Muslim community. Now, why I find that so interesting is they're not the official version of 9/11 from the 9/11 Memorial website does not say that they hate us for our freedoms, that they hate the fact that American women are allowed to go out showing some of their skin, that gay bars can exist, none of that. They're saying it's because of our actions in that region, our policies in that region. Although they prettify it by saying that, oh, we support governments that don't adhere to a fundamentalist Islamic view of the world, they are saying that part of Al-Qaeda's motive, which is undoubtedly true, which is a big part of why there's so much intense anti-Americanism in that region, is because we have a long history of imposing governments on those countries that are dictatorial, tyrannical, and designed to constrain the will of the people who live in those countries. And absolutely a huge part of their anger is that we impose people like General Sisi on Egypt. Even though the Egyptians had an election and elected somebody from the Muslim Brotherhoods, that's who they wanted, and we couldn't abide the will of the people of Egypt being able to be expressed democratically, so we helped overthrow that government and impose General Sisi, who continues to be a close U.S. ally to this date, one of the most tyrannical, savage dictators on the planet. We do the same in Saudi Arabia, which it's kind of odd to say that the U.S. only imposes governments that don't adhere to a fundamentalist view of Islam when our biggest ally in the region, the one that we support most, is Saudi Arabia. But you go down the line, Jordan and Qatar and the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait. We tried to do it with Iraq, obviously, as well. We impose governments on these people in that region for our own interests. And it destroys their ability to be free. That's the irony, is that we were told that they attacked us for our freedom, when in reality, part of the attack, as the 9/11 official 9/11 memorial site suggests quite strongly, their perception is that we are attacking their freedom by imposing governments on them that put dissidents in jail, that don't allow any kind of free speech or free assembly, because we want those populations controlled with an iron fist for our own interest. And even though a lot of people in the United States didn't understand that, because if they did, they wouldn't have asked, why are they angry at us? Why would they want to kill us? That's something that you barely ever hear in domestic discussion. Everyone knows that in the Middle East. It's very common knowledge. I mean, it's the history of their region. It's their country. That most of their governments that they despise have been imposed on them, obviously not democratically, have been imposed on them and propped up and funded by the United States. One of the earliest examples was the Iranian government that was democratically elected, that we disliked and overthrew in 1954 and imposed on them for the next several decades the rule by the Shah of Iran, a absolutely vicious tyrant, but he was pro-Western and pro-US and pro-Israel, so we liked him. And then finally, the people of Iran rose up and overthrew that US-supported dictator and now have the government that, at least at the time, most of them wanted. You can debate about what they want now. But that's what happens. If you impose dictatorships on other countries, they're going to be pretty angry at you for doing so. And the 9/11 site itself, in explaining why 9/11 happened, although again, they do it in the most pro-American way possible, are not even attempting to suggest that it had to do with their hatred for our freedoms, but instead anger over the way in which we've deprived theirs all throughout those decades leading up to 9/11. I think the first time that this narrative was unveiled was when George W. Bush, the president at the time, addressed a joint sessions of Congress on September 20th, 2001, so 9 days after the 9/11 attack. And I think it's worth remembering what a traumatizing time that was. People were angry, people were bewildered. It was shocking to watch the World Trade Center fall, collapse completely on top of 3,000 Americans, or to see a plane being flown into the Pentagon. It was obviously very destabilizing to American sense of security. Very shortly thereafter, there were the anthrax attacks that we were told, obviously falsely, that Iraq was behind, which we now know was actually coming from an American scientist who worked at a military facility in Frederick, Maryland. But in any event, that was the atmosphere. And so to hear the president speak basically for the first time in a formal setting about all of these events, the anthrax attacks hadn't happened yet, they were about to. They happened in mid-October. But still, it was obviously Americans wanted to hear from our president. And David Frum was George Bush's speechwriter, and he took this opportunity and used it to its maximum advantage. And here's part of what he said.
Americans are asking, why do they hate us? They hate what they see right here in this chamber. A democratically elected government. Their leaders are self-appointed. They hate our freedoms, our freedom of religion, our freedom of speech, our freedom to vote and assemble and disagree with each other. They want to overthrow existing...
No, I absolutely understand why that had an emotional punch. It was something very pleasing to Americans. Nobody wanted to hear, oh, they attacked you because you've been doing a lot of things to their countries for a long time. Your government has been bombing them and propping up dictators, overthrowing their democratically elected governments, having military bases in Saudi Arabia, which they consider sacred and heretical under their religion, supporting the Israelis as much as we do now against the Palestinians, and all the rest of our policies in the Middle East that provoke this level of anti-American rage. But here was George Bush saying exactly the opposite. No, they hate us because they hate democracy. They resent the fact that we get to decide our own fate. When in reality, that's what they wanted for themselves. That was part of their rage at the United States, was that they were living under dictatorships that had nothing to do with their choices. And it's just so ironic that a president can stand up in the most Orwellian way, say the exact opposite of the truth. That we are beacons of democracy, that they want to have, that they hate what we have, and attacked us because we get to have a Congress and free speech and freedom of religion. Why would they care what's happening on the other side of the world? They cared about what was happening in their part of the world, a world in which the United States played a very significant role and continues to, for the obvious dual reasons of wanting access to the oil, making sure the oil flows to our favor, and also wanting to protect Israel. Here was the White House daily briefing. At the time, the White House press secretary was Ari Fleischer, and every single year he posts this very detailed, endless account of what he saw happen on September 11th from the perspective of working in the White House, how George Bush learned about it, what they did after. You may recall that George Bush actually flew around in a circle for hours because they didn't know where they wanted to put him. He finally went to, I think, to Nebraska. I don't know if he did it this year. I purposely didn't look, but every year he publishes the same account, so it's an important day for Ari Fleischer as well. Here's what he said on October 10th, just a little bit short of 1 month after the September 11th attack, when giving a White House daily briefing.
With that, I'm happy to take questions. Ron?
Can you tell us about the discussions the White House has had with the networks about their coverage?
Yeah. Dr. Condoleezza Rice, the National Security Advisor, this morning called a group of network executives to raise their awareness about national security concerns of airing pre-recorded, pre-taped messages from Osama bin Laden that could be a signal to terrorists to incite attacks. It was a very collegial conversation. At best, Osama bin Laden's message is propaganda, calling on people to kill Americans. At worst, he could be issuing orders to his followers to initiate such attacks. Dr. Rice asked the networks to exercise judgment about how these pre-recorded, pre-taped messages will air. She stressed that she was making a request and that editorial decisions can only be made by the media.
Aria, do you
What was
have
their
a sense
response?
for what it is? Whether this is propaganda, or do you have suspicions that they may in fact be trying to convey something?
Well, people are analyzing that now. There are no easy conclusions to reach, but I think it's rather plain to have these thoughts, these suspicions about what it could include. That's why, as Dr. Rice indicated, at best, it's pre-taped, pre-recorded propaganda, but propaganda of a most insidious nature. At worst, it could be actually signaling to his operatives.
All right, I think it's so important to remember that happened. The U.S. government convinced the major television networks not to air any interviews or statements from the person they had accused of having perpetrated the 9/11 attack, who was Osama bin Laden. And the excuse that they used was he might be using some sort of code, like blinking with his eyes or some secret phrase that might activate a sleeper cell in the United States. Obviously, what he said there was, at best, it's propaganda. In other words, we don't want Americans hearing the other side. It's the same kind of impulse that led the EU to ban Russian state media, any social media company from platforming Russian state media, because they didn't want Europeans hearing the Russian side of the story, because they didn't want them to be able to compare. They wanted a closed information system where the only narrative that prevailed was the European one. And that was exactly what happened after 9/11. They knew Americans wanted to hear from the people accused of attacking us about why they hate the United States. And the US government was petrified that they were going to hear what bin Laden ended up saying, which were the real reasons the US attacked, that there was so much anti-American hatred in the region. And so they wanted to monopolize the propaganda, and they persuaded media outlets to engage in censorship by refusing any interviews with Osama bin Laden, either prior or since. And the media outlets, of course, complied. Weren't we all so angry about this over the last 3 years when we were hearing about how the Biden administration was pressuring big tech companies to remove certain types of dissent on the grounds that it was false or propagandistic or harmful? That's not what the government of the United States is supposed to do. We just heard George Bush on September 20th say they hate us because of our free speech. We allow ideas and dissent and debates to flourish. And yet the Bush White House told media outlets, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox, CNN, not to air any of this. Here from the New York Times on October 11th, a nation challenged the coverage. Quote, networks agree to the U.S. request to edit future bin Laden tapes. Quote, the 5 major television news organizations reached a joint agreement yesterday to follow the suggestion of the White House and abridge any future videotape statements from Osama bin Laden or his followers to remove language the government considers inflammatory, such as, look, the reason why this happened isn't because we hate your freedoms, it's because we hate how you're bombing our countries, overthrowing our governments, imposing dictators on us, putting military bases in our most sacred land, supporting the Israelis in their repression of the Palestinians, their violent, brutal, bloody repression of the Palestinians who are Arabs and Muslim. That is what they didn't want Americans to hear. Quote, the decision, the first time in memory that the networks had agreed to a joint agreement to limit their prospective news coverage. Again, that's so important. This was the first time in memory that the networks had agreed to a joint agreement to limit their prospective news coverage. That was described by one network executive as, quote, a patriotic decision that grew out of a conference call between the nation's top television news executives and the White House National Security Advisor Condoleezza Rice yesterday morning. Quote, this is a new situation, a new war, and a new kind of enemy, said Andrew Hayward, the president of CBS News. Quote, given the historic events we're enmeshed in, it is appropriate to explore new ways of fulfilling our responsibilities to the public by censoring. Walter Isaacson, the chairman of CNN, said, quote, it was very useful to hear their information and their thinking. He added, quote, after hearing Dr. Rice, we're not going to step on the landmine that she was talking about. Now, sometimes people will try and justify the things that happened in the weeks or couple months immediately following 9/11 as the byproduct of a sort of extraordinary climate. Now, we've been through wars before. We used to hear from the North Vietnamese all the time. During the Vietnam War, we heard from our enemies in the Korean War. We heard from the Japanese emperor and even Hitler during World War II. But even if you want to say, okay, we're going to give a pass to people and how they acted in mid and late September and into October, because it was just such a emotional time. No one knew what they should do. They were open to doing things they never would have thought were possible previously, like having networks enter an agreement with the White House to censor information that was both true and relevant to the public interest. You can make that case, but the reality is that same kind of censorship, that exact same kind of censorship, continues to this very day, 23 years later, 22, 23 years later. Let's remember this extremely important event that actually continues to shock me whenever I think about it. It was from NBC News, November 17, 2023. TikTok removes the hashtag for Osama bin Laden's letter to America after viral videos circulate. The Guardian also pulled the text of the Al-Qaeda founder's letter from its website after people cited it on TikTok and X. Throughout the week, TikTok users had been sharing the link to the Guardian's transcript of bin Laden's letter, which was written about a year after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attack. The Guardian took the letter down from its website Wednesday. In the letter, bin Laden addressed the American people and sought to answer the following questions. Quote, why are we fighting and opposing you? And quote, what are we calling you to? And what do we want from you? The letter includes anti-Semitic language and homophobic rhetoric. Ooh. Better suppress that letter. There's no other anti-Semitism or homophobia that one might hear. Get rid of that. Now, what happened here is actually fascinating, which is that this was in the wake of young people becoming aware for the first time of the close relationship between the United States and Israel, how the U.S. funds and arms Israel's attacks on its neighbors, including defenseless Palestinians in Gaza. And as part of that attempt to understand history, which of course is what you want young Americans to do, to question what they've been told, to question the narratives they've been fed, they found for the first time a letter that they had no idea existed, which was the letter that Osama bin Laden wrote a year after the 9/11 attack, where he attempted to answer the question that the United States government had already provided the answer to for a full year and censored any questioning or dissent to it by preventing him from being heard. And they read the letter and they were shocked because the letter doesn't say we hate you because you allow gay bars and women to appear in bathing suits and you get to have a Congress and free speech. There were references to our decadent culture in their view that contained some of those criticisms, but the point of the letter was the reason we hate you, the reason we want to attack you, the reason we will continue to try to attack you is because you've been attacking us for decades. Through your interference in our countries, through your bombing of our civilians and killing of our children, through your funding of Israel and arming of Israel. And obviously, you don't have to agree with that. You don't have to agree, obviously, that those grievances justify the 9/11 attack. You don't even have to agree that that's the real reason that Osama bin Laden was motivated to hate the United States. But it's absolutely unquestionably true, no doubt about it at all, not even disputable, that a significant part of the anti-Americanism in 9/11, in that region, was motivated by those things. And so when young people found this letter and they began to say, wow, part of why 9/11 happened wasn't because they hate our freedoms, as we were already told, but instead it was because we were bombing their countries and imposing dictatorships on them and overthrowing their democratically elected governments, and because of their supporting of Israel, look at what happened. The government and most of establishment society demanded that that be censored, that those young people no longer be allowed to see that letter, to talk about that letter, to discuss with each other what that letter says, what it means, what it revealed to them. And so the Guardian, one of the oldest newspapers in the West, removed the letter from its website so that nobody could read it any longer, nobody could link to it any longer. That was one of the only places where it existed. That's where the people on TikTok found it. And that's where they were linking to say, oh, go read this. So the Guardian removed the letter, this is of a great historic importance, from their own site, and then pressured TikTok to ban any discussion of it. And that's exactly what TikTok did. So 23 years later, yet again, there was no discussion allowed of what the real reasons were that motivated anti-American hatred in that region. Here from The Guardian, you can't go to The Guardian's website and see this anymore. They removed it. Once people actually started reading it, they took it down. A news outlet took down this extremely important historical letter. But you can go to the Wayback Machine and still see it. Here it is, The Guardian letter to America, November 24th, 2002. And originally it said full text, Bin Laden's letter to America. And here is part of Osama bin Laden's explanation about why there's so many people in the region who hate the United States. A, you attacked us in Palestine. Palestine, which has sunk under military occupation for more than 80 years. The British handed over Palestine with your help and your support to the Jews who have been occupying it for more than 50 years. Years overflowing with oppression, tyranny, crimes, killing, expulsion, destruction, and devastation. The creation and continuation of Israel is one of the greatest crimes, and you are the leaders of its criminals. And of course, there is no need to explain and prove the degree of American support for Israel. B, you attacked us in Somalia. You supported the Russian atrocities against us in Chechnya, the Indian oppression against us in Kashmir, and the Jewish aggression against us in Lebanon. C, under your supervision, consent, and orders, the governments of our countries, which act as your agents, attack us on a daily basis. E, your forces occupy our countries. You spread your military bases throughout them. You corrupt our lands and besiege our sanctities to protect the security of the Jews and to ensure the continuity of your pillage of our treasures, meaning oil. F, you have starved the Muslims of Iraq, where children die every day, talking about the sanctions regime imposed by the Clinton administration. Is it a wonder that more than 1.5 million Iraqi children have died as a result of your sanctions and you did not show concern? Yet when 3,000 of your people died, the entire world rises and has not yet sat down. Is it in any way rational to expect that after America has attacked us for more than half a century, that we will then leave her to live in security and peace? 3, you may then dispute that all this does not justify aggression against civilians for crimes they did not commit and offenses in which they did not partake. This argument contradicts your continuous repetition that America is the land of freedom and its leaders in the world. Therefore, the American people are the ones who chose their government by way of their own free will, a choice which stems from their agreement to its policies. Thus, the American people have chosen, consented to, and affirmed their support for the Israeli oppression of the Palestinians, the occupation and usurpation of their land, and the continuous killing, torture, punishment, and expulsion of the Palestinians. The American people have the ability and choice to refuse the policies of their government and even to change it if they want. Now, that is a repulsive moral rationale, that we can kill civilians because they bear a responsibility for their government that they chose and therefore the policies of it. But it's worth noting that that is the primary justification for why people will defend Israel basically destroying the entire civilian infrastructure of Gaza. They'll say, back in 2006, the last time Gazans voted, almost 20 years ago, when half their population weren't even alive, let alone old enough to vote, they chose Hamas as their government and therefore are now eternally responsible for anything Hamas does. So there's no innocent civilian in Gaza. They're all Hamas supporters. That was exactly Osama bin Laden's rationale for why he believed it necessary or justified to attack American civilians. I have a few more things to show you. We have our guests here, so I just want to stop for a second and just kind of underscore this point, which is that if you're a free citizen, if you're somebody who is engaged with the world, the one thing you want to avoid doing is living in a closed information society where the only messaging you hear is the messaging of which your government approves. Because when that happens, your free choice, your democratic vote, your freedom of thought and assembly are all illusory. Because the only information you're getting is a very partial picture. And when human beings have that power to censor what they don't want you to hear and feed you and submerge your brain only in what they do, they're going to use it. That's a power that no human can resist the abuse of. And that's what happened after 9/11. And not only after 9/11, but it continues to this very day. Think about how unbelievable it is that young people found that bin Laden letter, started to read it, started to talk about, wait a minute, is there more to the 9/11 story than we've been told? Did our own policies in the region contribute to the anger that led to that? Does it still contribute to anger in that region? You don't have to agree with any of that. You can think that 9/11 happened because they hate our freedoms, that all of that was just pretext or invented or whatever, but the idea that that should not be available to read, that people should be barred in the United States from discussing it, is unbelievable, especially given that 9/11 continues to be exploited as a symbol of our great freedom, of the fact that we are a free people banned from hearing any other side of the story other than the narrative that we've been fed. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.